colourful drawing by my 5-year-old granddaughter. At school today, in a local public school, they were talking about voice, treaty and truth. Isn't that fantastic? In our school system. She was so proud of it, and she wanted me to bring it along and share with you tonight, because I said I was talking about the same sorts of things. Anyway, isn't that encouraging? Sean, do you think that's encouraging? That this topic, this big topic, is now being discussed in our primary schools?
Absolutely, I think it's fantastic, Jill. But first I'd like to acknowledge country, pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank you, Ray, for that, the welcome tonight, and thank you all for coming. Absolutely, Jill, and I can imagine, you know, if the true history was taught back when I was younger, I generally believe we would be in a different position today. And then if you go back even further than myself, you know, I think Australia would be a much celebrated country, and in the way in which it talks about our history, talks about the truth, and puts it all out there, especially with kids. And it's truly amazing to see young people now getting that history and truly
yeah, I was blown away. That was fantastic. Sean, you've been a key driver in this whole process through Gidgee, through Uphold and Recognise. Let's start at the basics. What does the Uluru Statement from the Heart ask of us?
Well, I think it's probably more important, Jill, to go back one further step, and that's to understand the process that took place in getting to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I'm pleased that if you look in this top corner, the third signature down is my name up there and with my signature. And so,
go you.
But when I think back to the process that took place, it was the first time that 13 dialogues were carried out right across the country, where Indigenous people were engaged and brought together through regional dialogues. And I tell you, they were very tough regional dialogues. I attended the Dubbo regional dialogues, and day one was just brutal, absolutely brutal. But it was brutal from the perspective is that it was the first time in a long time that our people had a forum or a space to talk about the challenges in our community, the disempowerment, the struggles that people are facing every day in our communities. But once we got through that tough first day, and our people got down to business, it ended up producing this document. You know, from those 13 dialogues and coming together at Uluru, we produced a document that simply said, we want a voice, and we want to say in our own affairs. We want proper recognition through agreement making, through treaties or Makarrata, and we want the truth to be told about our history. It was simple. You know, there was expectation that we were going to change race clauses in the Constitution. There was expectation that we were proposing to do all of these constitutional amendments. In fact, all we were looking for in the Constitution was to recognise an Indigenous voice that can't be abolished by governments, giving it certainty that our voice would survive beyond elections and that our people would be able to continue to represent our needs. And that was the most important aspect of it from my perspective.
We are here to celebrate this very significant piece of Australian document making, and the language is magnificent. Are you celebrating it, John Maynard?
Yes, well, I certainly think it's an important and a very powerful document, but certainly for me, when I first read the Uluru Statement of the Heart, it struck a very powerful chord with me. And I'm talking about history. This is not a recent thing, and as that film showed, it's a long journey for us. It goes back over decades and decades and decades, and even further back than Rachel's film. I mean, there's quite a few people would know that a lot of my work has been on the rise of the early Aboriginal political movement. The first united all Aboriginal political organisation formed in 1924 in Sydney, the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, led by my grandfather Fred Maynard. Now, what struck me when I read that statement was several connections with the manifesto that the AAPA produced in 1927. That organisation held their first annual conference in Sydney at St David's Church and Hall in Surrey Hills. They were front page news in the press. And I'll just comment about three connections with the Uluru Statement. And the first was in fact about, and Sean just alluded to that fact, about power over our own destiny, which is embedded in this magnificent document. And I'll take that back to 1925. In my grandfather's opening address as president of the Australian Aboriginal and Progressive Association, he opened his address with the words, "Brothers and sisters, we have much business to transact, so let's get right down to it. Our people have not had the courage to stand together in the past, but now we are united to fight for the things which are near and dear to us. We want to be in charge of our own destiny." The very same words from 1925 up to 2017. That's one of the things that has struck in this country. Over so many decades, different governments at all levels, we know what's best for you. We've been crying out from the get-go. We want to be in charge of our own destiny. We want power over our own destiny. The second one that struck me was the call for self-determination. The AAPA in 1925 were front page news in the Sydney press. The banners read, "Aborigines demand self-determination. Aborigines call for self-determination." This was 50 years before the Whitlam government accredited with putting up self-determination as Aboriginal policy. And finally, I've just lost my thought then. Someone's phone's ringing.
Phone a friend.
Was the call for a voice in Parliament through this document, a critically important point. In 1927, the AAPA produced a manifesto, and that was delivered to state government, federal government. It was published widely across the state of New South Wales, in Queensland, in Victoria, in South Australia. And those demands in that manifesto, which has been largely missed historically, was the demand for a national land rights agreement, enough land for each and every Aboriginal family in the country, to stop the practice of removing Aboriginal children from their families, to protect the distinct Aboriginal cultural identity, citizenship rights in our own country. But most importantly, they said they wanted state control over Aboriginal lives abolished, a protection board taken away, and an all-Aboriginal board to sit under the Commonwealth government. That was 1927. And here we are, 2017, asking for the very same thing. And I'll just, before I finish, there was one other thing. I mean, this is the importance of history being forgotten. In many cases, I would say purposefully erased for us, because there was that separation from history, certainly from the 1930s on. There was a conference in Kempsey in late 1925 where over 700 Aboriginal people were in attendance over 3 days. Ray and I and Mandy were up there last year, and the old heritage building at the Kempsey Showground is still there. It's a heritage listed place. We got, through the aid of the caretaker, allowed into that building. It just made all the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, knowing that 700 Aboriginal people were there in 1927. All the papers were written and delivered by Aboriginal people. The Macleay Argus and Macleay Chronicle said several of these papers were delivered in lingo, in language. This is a time when the anthropologists are already impacting onto us and saying there is no culture in New South Wales, there is no language in New South Wales. Yet here we are delivering papers in language, and clearly we can understand it. These are the important aspects of history that we need to explore and put out to inspire our young people in the future. And I again emphasise, it's not just about us. This is a shared space. And I look historically, and that was shown in that film. We will always remain a heavily marginalised minority unless we get middle non-Indigenous support. And historically, as Rachel's film has shown, we did. Charlie Perkins with the Freedom Ride, the Gurindji walk off at Wade Hill in 66, the 67 referendum, the tent embassy in 72. Gary Foley will tell you there were large numbers of non-Indigenous students from ANU standing there with us in support of that moment. And again, the bicentenary, the corroborative walk across Sydney Harbour Bridge in 2000, 500,000 people. That's what we need to mobilise again with this. And that's what I'm looking forward to.
Jackie, do you think this statement and this time in Australian life is, do you think the elements are there to enable that, to ride on that history? Are we ready for it, in your observation?
In my observation, and after 4 decades, 40 years of, this year actually, of being in the struggle in terms of Indigenous rights, our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander rights, I am hopeful that something, I think the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a catalyst to do that, if people get behind it. And, you know, I agree, you know, we are tired, we're very tired of explaining our pain to you on a regular basis. You know, day after day, explaining to wider Australia what has happened to our people throughout our history. I think it's time, very timely that the Uluru Statement came into vogue, because our people have said, right, you know, enough's enough. You know, we have seen, whilst we have seen some glacial changes in our country, it's not enough, it's not good enough. And there needs to be much more. And I think there is a willingness behind non-Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Australians to do something that, as the T-shirt says, to do something that is right. And this is right.
Yeah, this is right. And there have been some very interesting, well, it seems interesting, initiatives, such as the petition, what was her name?
Fiona Stanley
and
Goldie from
and Goldie, a petition with thousands of names on it, the involvement of some corporations. What does this involvement by the rest of the community, the non-Aboriginal community, actually need to look like to make a difference, to cut through the historical delay in our ability to do it? What does it look like? Does it look like the kind of action of the 70s? Does it look like something very different? What do you need from the rest of the community, Sean?
Well, I think, you know, the sort of, you know, the most immediate action I can point to of recent years is the same-sex marriage campaign and the way in which that gathered momentum. But the challenge we have in this space is not every person in the country is connected to an Aboriginal person. In the same-sex marriage, you know, you were connected somehow to someone who sat in one of those categories. So it was much easier for you to get a connection to the types of challenges and the oppression that those people were experiencing. It's much tougher in our circumstance because, you know, let's face it, the reality is today you can be a non-Indigenous Australian today and live your whole life without ever engaging or experiencing interacting with Indigenous people. So there's a real challenge there, and there's this massive disconnect as to how you draw people in to take interest in our story and what it is we need to do. The other challenge is, and this is always a concern, is our marginalisation. We make up less than 3% of the population, not just in the country, but we make up less than 3% of our population in all of our institutions. So we're constantly having to push back against this 97%, regardless of what space we're in, whether we're you know, whether it's just the general population, whether you're in Parliament, whether you're in the university systems, whether you're in government systems, we are constantly sitting there as the 3% trying to advocate our position.
But Sean, studies have shown that there is 60% of the community, the broad total community, support what the statement calls for. And it was the same for same-sex marriage. 60% of the population of Australia supports it. With 60% of the population supporting it, that should make a significant difference.
It should make a difference, but what we've not mastered, I think, on our side as Indigenous people, is we've not properly identified how non-Indigenous people can engage in this discussion. This is not our, you know, I think as Ray said, as John says, as Jackie said, we've done enough. Our people have been fighting this for such a long time. But at the same time, we've got to be willing to allow others to step into this space and fight alongside us, stand alongside us and take this battle up. I see a lot of people in this room and I see a lot of faces at lots of events like this, a lot of really good people. But they would be also challenged as to, well, I want to help, but what can I do? I don't think we've properly defined yet our non-Indigenous Australians can step into this space with us and take up the mantle with us. And that's something we need to, we've got to sort out fairly quickly. Because the longer this drags out, we lose momentum and people will move then on to the next, you know, thing. Here's the next thing that we need to put our interest behind.
Do you agree with that, Jackie?
What we haven't done necessarily, it's been ever since, you know, Dot, I think today, Dot, not the black dots, Murray, probably will get that. Is that we haven't got the messaging right. Now, I'm very excited, been involved with a project from she's a cognitive language expert from the States who really cut through on the refugee asylum seekers. When she did focus groups in, you know, rural New South Wales, 25%, the highest rate, she said, against the notion of accepting, you know, refugees in. We have embarked on a project with her that looks at hopefully cutting through the messages around, you know, our space and what we need to target, how the message can get through to white Australia, to all Australia really, that are not us. Hopefully, and that's going to take probably a couple of years, but you know, we just haven't been able to sell what it is that we really are asking for or wanting, or who we are, you know, in a very real sense. Because I get the question too, like I'm sure, you know, my brothers here get around, what can we do to help, you know, how can we do it? My usual answer is that, I said this to a guy sitting in the audience, I said, so are you a businessman? He said, yes. And I said, well, go and employ some Aboriginal people, why don't you, you know? You know it, you've got it in your heart. I don't know you, but you know what you can do for us. So those kind of little practical things kind of work, but it's the big national message that we need to take out there, especially around, you know, the aspirational document that the Uluru Statement from the Heart is, but also what's the practicalities that it can bring not only to us, but to the rest of Australia in terms of the whole nation-building exercises that we need to have here.
Forward to trying to imagine how our country might be different if, let's assume we've agreed to this statement from the heart, unchanged, we're 5-10 years hence, we've had those discussions, Jackie, we've had the focus groups, we've had more of these sessions, we've got this passed. Just think for a moment, Sean, about your area, your particular interest in economic empowerment of Aboriginal people. How would it be different? How would your community, our nation, look and feel differently?
Look, I think the best example of that is to look overseas, and if you look at New Zealand at the moment, and you look at the Maoris' contribution to the economy, it is substantial. You know, it is substantial beyond belief. The Maori, the different circumstances in regards to they make up 18% of the population and now 3% and so on. But when you look at their economic contribution annually, it's $50 billion. 50 billion. When the same research was done here in Australia, it was only $6 billion Indigenous economic contribution to the country. And so there is a major economic contribution, not just to Indigenous Australians, but to non-Indigenous Australians by engaging with our people, and our people being properly recognised and being able to engage in business, being able to use our lands. If we look at the current structures of land rights and native title right across the country, very little of it empowers our people economically. It's only where you've got the opportunity to potentially negotiate mining rights that you may be able to create some wealth from it. But native title for my people, the Barkindji people out of Western New South Wales, all it done was determine that 95% of the land mass of the Barkindji land mass was extinguished through the Western land leases. So it left 5% of the land mass for our people to try and build an economic base. And so we've really got to start to look at this in terms of, at the moment, there is a deficit. The federal government spends $34 billion annually in this Indigenous affairs space. Now, don't ask me where it goes. I've got no idea where it goes, and I've got no idea what it does, because it's not addressing Indigenous disparity and it's not improving the circumstances of our people. But they continue to spend it every year. But until we're empowered, until our people are leading the change and driving the change, and are able to build an economic base with the opportunities that we've already got, then we will start to see change. Mm-hmm. But I continually ask myself, Julie, is what does a successful post-referendum world look like for Indigenous Australians? Mm-hmm. And for me, we are empowered economically, culturally and socially. Non-Indigenous Australians embrace our culture and celebrate it, and our history is celebrated and recognised, just as we do. I do the Anzac walk I do the walk, the Strzelecki Lookout walk. Every time I get a chance, I go in and do that walk. And we recognise all of these wars that took place that Australia were involved in. But there's nothing there that recognises our people's battles. It should be a no-brainer that Newcastle would want to see Indigenous people clearly cut out in steel there as defending their shores, defending their lands. But there is nothing of that. We hide that history. And the type of language that I'm using now, people clearly badge it as, oh, that's a black armband view of the world. The opposite to that is the white blindfold view of the world. And people not wanting to see that this history took place, that our people stood tall, we fought back, we were resilient.
It's quite incredible because that walk, the Strzelecki walk, is such a recent addition to our city, and it wouldn't have taken, John Maynard, a lot of engagement between the powerful people that had the money to build that to think how Aboriginal story could be involved.
That's right. That's an amazing thing. I mean, Mick Dodson and I were involved in this Serving Our Country project. We looked at Aboriginal military service with this country, which was also overlooked. And there's great pride in our communities that our people have served in every military campaign this country has fought in, from the Boer War right through to Afghanistan and Iraq today. But the point that Sean's touched on is, it overlooks the fact, and that is the point, of the frontier wars where tens of thousands of our people lost their lives, and non-Indigenous people as well, in the war that was waged in this country. And yet the Australian War Memorial continues to deflect that and steer away from that. I mean, there's a memorial up the back in regards to that history. I will say, you look at Myall Creek, and back in 2015 I gave the Myall Creek address there. And this is what can happen when a community decides to recognise and come together and look at what happened there. in 1838 where 28 Aboriginal people were slaughtered, older men, women and children, and the 7 of those people that committed that crime were hung. I mean, that is one point, and it was non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people coming together to make this incredible event up there to recognise what happened in the past. People coming together to heal from the past. And it is just incredible. When I spoke there was a non-Indigenous couple that had driven all the way from Perth in a car with a caravan on the back to come across and recognise that particular event. And that's what can happen when people come together. And again, I stress that. I mean, those guys that were hung at Mile Creek, and I've always said that was a patsy at that particular point in time, because only 3 months before, Major Nunn led a military expedition which slaughtered hundreds of Aboriginal people, but there was nothing done against that military campaign. So those squatters and stockmen that were a part of that group that killed the 28, they were then hung as a scapegoat for what hundreds had died before. So, but again, I really think that Mile Creek event is a showcase to show what can be done to heal from the past.
Jackie, you're involved in a lot of activity now about trying to bring this statement from the heart to fruition. Can you tell us the sorts of things that involves? What does that look like?
Before I do, I just quickly pick up on John's point is that in our country, we have never had the deep conversations that need to be had. And I think certainly sooner the better. You know, the Truth-Telling Commission has to be a must, where we speak of the unpalatables of our history. But we also celebrate the successes of, you know, where we've come from to where we've gotten to. It's a mixed bag, really. But in order to know, like your little granddaughter, that's fantastic, you know, 5 years old, is she? To even be thinking about those issues around voice, truth and treaty is just quite outstanding. And I'm sure that's why John and I became, you know, historians, because I got sick and tired of hearing about the kings and queens of England in school. I thought there's got to be a bit more to this than, you know. I always thought that our people passively resisted, handed over land. It was only until I was about 19 that I discovered the truth that really that didn't happen. You know, there was resistance, there was guerrilla warfare in much of this country where we actually stood up for our land. And so that, I think that needs to be totally addressed, absolutely. The sooner the better it needs to, and hopefully, you know, through the school system. What's happening now around the country in terms of the Uluru Statement from the Heart is that there are groups that are working on the voice, the proposed models. There's been recent meetings in Cairns and Sydney, I think, other places that bring together some people to try to progress it. Now, the government has given 7.2 million, I think, for the for that extension of that. Not quite sure where it's going to, or who's getting it, or whatever. But you know, that's a good start, I think. Labor, of course, were promising something I think was just much more than that. But you know, at least you know, we have a start with that. You know, as Sean said, our mob are trying to come together and try to organise ourselves, because unless we're unified, they'll pick us off. Governments will pick us off.
Is there unity?
Oh, well.
Is there unity in what for?
Great
point.
Consensus or anything like that?
No.
Our mob too. So, yeah,
Exactly.
that's human nature.
I actually think think we're getting much closer to a position where our people are united on.
Yeah.
I think that unity came about when Malcolm Turnbull rejected the Uluru Statement. I think that went to the heart of all of our people, whether you're on this, whether you're pushing a sovereignty position, whether you're pushing a treaty position, whether you're pushing constitutional recognition. That was a kick in the guts to all of us. And that galvanised our people in a sense that we took our differences out of the public and we took them behind to say, okay, these guys are, I'm over here on the sovereignty side, so I'm really on the left of the black armband, I'm out here. But here's these groups over here who put up a decent proposal. They got kicked, they got well into the kick in the guts. And so it did galvanise us and bring us a little bit closer together where we're, and we start to look at the theme, voice, treaty, truth is basically what we're asking for. That's been our people. Our people we've had differences and we've put proposals forward. Those proposals have been kicked to the gutter and our people have then rebuilt. And we've rebuilt and we've continued and then we'll come back. And I think that's the fundamental, the value of our people is we're not going away. And although there's been a great attempt to do this, we're just not going away. And, even, and I'm hopeful at the moment. There's been an announcement that came out today that Scott Morrison is now going to put this agenda at the next COAG meeting in Cairns in August. So I'm hopeful that this discussion will start to happen. The Coalition also put together, committed $160 million towards a referendum, as well as the $7.3 million, I think it was, towards the education conversation piece to happen. So there is hope. But the challenge for our people, and John I think said this, is our people have always lived on hope. We've got to get beyond that.
Yeah. The $160 million earmarked or dedicated by the Morrison government, has that got a timeline on it? Are they saying that money has to be spent and you've got a deadline for this referendum? Or is that
there
more flexible?
There isn't a timeline on it. And
which is good, because that would be really unfair.
The early, Morrison getting elected, it's indicated that they're not going to do anything within this term, which for me is not acceptable. It's not acceptable that we then push it out beyond this term, and then if the Coalition don't get re-elected, then we're starting all over again with then a Labor government. And you know what? Whether it's a Coalition government or a Labor government, I think we're in a stronger position with a Coalition government, or the fact that I think it would be tougher to get the Coalition to support a Labor government on an Indigenous voice. It would be much easier, I think, to get a Labor opposition to support a Coalition government in that perspective. But but again, these are all the challenges that we face as Indigenous people. So imagine us sitting here and listening to Jackie explain what activities that we've been putting together. We're putting activities together, but we're putting them together on the smell of the Northern Rain. Government have put resources on their side to say, yep, we've got $7.2 million. They're not giving it to us to be able to go and do the work to educate people.
Who's funding all of this?
Who funds the Uphold and Recognise event? I've got great sponsors here tonight: Life Without Barriers, Hunter Water, University of Newcastle, the Wabakal Limited. Local organisations have contributed towards making this event happen. Who funds the work of Uphold and Recognise? I managed to get a couple of corporate companies to give me enough funds to be able to employ a CEO to run. And when I say Uphold and Recognise, it's one person who's David, who some of you may have met. It's David and myself as a director and another director. There's three of us. So
you don't have offices all around the world, Sean.
Yeah, but that's not just us. That's when we look at the other people in this campaign. It's also those people doing the work on the left, on the right, in the centre, we're all trying to do this on the smell of an oil rag. And that's the torment of our power.
Yes.
Well, I think Sean's touched on us as a people, our resilience. We've suffered a lot of disappointments over a long period of time. And for me, I mean, we suffer through governments changing, and the reality is there should be a bipartisan approach to Aboriginal affairs from both sections of government. Each Liberal or Labor comes in, there's a policy there, we start to work our way through that, there's a change of government, and we're back to start one. But over and over again. I mean, these are the disappointments over decades that we've suffered. So there needs to be a bipartisan approach to Aboriginal affairs, that we can actually work on something over 5, 7, even 10 years, where we can measure some results of what's working. Because things are thrown out after 4 years and you start again from scratch.
Yeah,
And
incredibly frustrating.
That's clear at the moment with Ken now coming in.
Yeah.
Ken Wyatt.
He's completely set up a new agency and a new approach and
Yeah.
something. And I don't know if it's going to work or not going to work.
That's right.
But our people experience it every time. there's
Every
an
time, that's right,
Something
every
new.
time.
Yeah. One thing that we haven't touched on specifically is the Makarrata Commission and what it's asking for and how it might operate. And it speaks to me that it's about having the tough conversations about our history. Jackie, I wonder if you could speak to how it will work, the Makarrata.
I think that's still being in design as we speak. I know there's a group in Melbourne that are having conversations in a workshop in July, of which I'll be attending in relation to the kinds of conversations that need to happen. I know that Mick Dodson and Simon Longhurst from the Ethics Council, are also having talks. But what I've said is that, you know, we really need to coordinate this, come together, because what we don't want are kind of splinter groups trying to get to the same goal. But that's important too. I mean, you know, we need left, right, centre politics doing this, but we need to try to know who's on first, second and third base here and try to drive that through. But it's very hard, as Sean says, you know, when you have no resources or no, you know, you're just given crumbs all the time in order to run huge national or international projects. And Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people always suffer from that default. Yeah.
I mean, that process already must have cost a fortune. And people, I mean, and there's no direct government funding for it.
So the process today did cost a fortune. The dialogues were funded by government. The government said, well, we want you to go out and consult your people. We want your people to tell us what they want. Now people have responded to the government and said, this is what we want.
The biggest medium today which we need to engage is mass media, and that's our young people. Twitter, Facebook, that's the big thing today with elections, with everything else. We tap into that. That's where we can make change. In reality, it reaches across the globe in that respect. We've got young people, my kids are I can't even get the thing to work half the time. But this is the thing with young people, and we've got to get them on board and driving that sort of stuff. And that's where you can actually mobilise movement and support on a massive scale.
There's so much to do.
Yes.
I admire your persistence, but I think it's time for the broader audience that's here tonight to put up your hand and think, what could you do? I mean, it's been sort of spelled out fairly clearly, I think, tonight. That would be a useful conversation, I think. What opportunities are there for us as non-Aboriginal people in this city at this point in time to lend a hand to make this thing real? I mean,